Welcome back to the Gospel of Matthew. Tonight's video lecture will go over the historical context of the Gospel of Matthew. Then we'll turn to the actual text itself, the birth narrative and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. What you see in front of you here is the earliest piece of manuscript that we have from the Gospel of Matthew. This comes from the 2nd century. And as you can see, most of the papyrus paper has already disintegrated, but scholars can tell this, from this Greek script here that this is part of the Gospel of Matthew. So this gives you an idea of how hard it is for scholars to construct an original text of the Gospel of Matthew. They take manuscripts like this, pieces of manuscripts like this, gathered from all over the ancient world, compare them, see where they agree and disagree, and then they have to make editorial decisions about which ones they think are the most authentic and the most early, and things of that nature. And that comes up to be the Greek New Testament, or the Greek text from the Gospel of Matthew. So that gives you an idea of how hard it is to get the text as we have it today. The Gospel of Matthew. This is a painting of the Gospel that depicts the author of Matthew writing, and you see it's a blank piece of paper. What's real interesting about this painting, it is true to life in the sense that it's trying to show the original writer writing in Hebrew, because he's going from left to right, although there's no ink on paper yet. But this is from the Middle Ages. The other part is an angel in the corner, kind of inspiring Matthew. This is different than the Caravaggio, where Matthew's looking up and the angel's dictating to it. This is an earlier painting, so it's a little less obvious that any dictation's happening. It's that this is more of an inspiration than anything else. So the Gospel of Matthew has at least three contexts, if you will. There's an overarching Jewish context to the Gospel of Matthew. We said this just briefly last class period, that Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels that we have in the New Testament. We'll look at this Jewish context with a little bit more depth tonight. But there's also a deeply Roman context. As you can see from the map here on the slide, the darker region is the Roman Empire in the 1st century of the Common Era, when the Gospel of Matthew was written. And we'll see this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So there's a Jewish context, there's a Roman context, but a specific context is Antioch of Syria. Last class we talked about the fact that the gospel was most likely written in Antioch of Syria, which we'll show with a little bit more detail. If you look at this map right here, this is the map. This is the region of Syria, or the Roman province of Syria. Here is the Roman province of Judea. So you can see that Antioch of Syria isn't terribly far from Jerusalem. And if you go Caesarea, if you go just a little bit north of there into this little blue dot, that is the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee. And that region would have been the Galilee region. Scholars kind of debate whether the Gospel of Matthew was written in this region or in the city of Antioch. And I think we talked enough about it last week to understand that I'm going to argue that the Gospel was written in Antioch due to some of the reasons we find in the letter to the Galatians by Paul. So let's talk about this Jewish context. Judaism in the 1st century is a tricky issue, and a lot of scholars argue whether it is a thing or not, as far as a bona fide religion, that in modern terms of religion. So you'll see some scholars, instead of referring to Judaism or Jews, they'll refer to Judeans and Judeanness. And this is basically talking about the province of Judea, which is modern Israel for the most part, a little bit larger than that in ancient context. And so that the God of the Jews is the God of the Judeans, those who lived in the region of Judea. And that is a geographical fixture. So Judeans were people from the region of Judea. And so it is a geographical context, a national context, if you will, not unlike Americans being from America, or the, French being from France. It is a geographical anchor, not a religious term per se. So the word at least has a geographical context. And what comes with geography is an ethnic context. Judeans were an ethnic had an ethnic understanding. So you were born a Judean because you were born in Judea with Judean parents. And that was an ethnic fixture, like Egyptian is an ethnic fixture, like Roman is an ethnic fixture. Judean would carry both geography and ethnicity. But the other thing that informs the identity of Judean is a religious context, a cultic context, in the sense that the God of Judea had a temple, and that temple was in Jerusalem. And Jews believed that was the house of God, literally the place where God lived. And the Holy of Holies was the room within the temple that God lived. And the Ark of the Covenant was the throne room. It was the throne of God where God sat. So Judean in the first century at least had those three contexts. It had a geographical, ethnic, and religious context. But it also had a political context, because just before Rome annexed Judea, it was an independent and autonomous nation. When the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees revolted against the Greeks way back in the first, second century of the before the Common Era, they had become an autonomous country. So they did have political figures like the king of Israel. Herod the Great was the king of Israel when Augustus Caesar was the Caesar of Rome. So they had political leaders as well. So the concept of Judean had both geographic, ethnic, political, and religious connotations. And so the word diaspora is important because these were Judeans who lived outside of Judea. In 587, before the Common Era, Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem and took the ruling elite away in exile to Babylon. So even during the first century, there were a lot of Judeans who lived in Babylon and because they had never returned. So there in that, you have a exile community, a diaspora community in Babylonia. You also had a diaspora Judean community in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece, and in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. And that Asia Minor would go all the way down to the province of Syria, where Antioch was. And even though that's close to Judea, it is still not in Judea. So the Jews and Judeans who lived there would be considered a diaspora Judeans. And diaspora or diaspora means dispersed, those who are spread out. So Judean is a loaded term, and I will use Judean and Jew interchangeably. The reason historians and New Testament scholars, don't like to talk about Judean as Jew is because they don't know how much of a religious context that word had outside of Judea. They know it had religious connotations, but it wasn't. It was just different in that time period than the way we conceive of religion today. What is the Jewish context in relation to religion? One thing that separated Judeans religiously from almost every other ethnic, religious, political, geographic entity in the world was the fact that Judeans were monotheistic. They only believed that there was one God. Deuteronomy 6:4 is kind of the statement of monotheism within Judaism, and it's called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So this is a declaration of one God, which would have put them at odds with almost every culture around them, because Greeks and Romans and Persians and Egyptians were all polytheistic, and they believed in many gods. Judeans claimed that there was only one God, and that one God was their God. Their God had a proper name, Elohim, not Elohim. The proper name for God was Yahweh, and Elohim just simply means God. So Yahweh was the name of the God of Judea. They believed that that was the only God, and this was very it created huge contrast between the pantheons of Greece, Rome, Persia, and all the other peoples surrounded them. So they only believed in one God. They did have a set of scriptures. The Torah. This is a real interesting thing because Torah can mean all the scriptures, or it can mean the law, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. So it could be specific to those 5 books, or it could be the whole thing. So that's another characteristic, defining characteristic of Judeanness. They were monotheistic. They believed in scriptures. The other thing that's not listed here is when the Gospel of Matthew, just before the Gospel of Matthew was written, the temple served a huge religious function for Judeans in Judea and in the diaspora. That's not a part of this because when the Gospel of Matthew was written, the temple had been utterly destroyed. So there was a movement during the time of Matthew for Judeans to move from a temple-based religion to a Torah-based religion. So all of their religion that had circulated around the temple, after the temple was destroyed, it then revolved around text, scriptures, Torah. One thing prescribed in the scriptures, the Judean scriptures, was circumcision for men. This was when the foreskin of the penis was cut off. This happened, according to Scripture, on the 8th day after a male child was born. And it was a defining characteristic for Judeans in the Greco-Roman world, where men would go to the gymnasium, which was a central part of civilian life in Greco-Roman society. When men went to the gymnasium, they would exercise and compete against each other nude. And so when they went to the public baths, they would be nude in the baths. So circumcision wasn't just a private matter. It was a public matter because of the way society was structured in the Greco-Roman world. So circumcision would have been a very obvious distinction between Jews and Gentiles, Jews and Greeks and Romans. And it was a defining characteristic of Judaism as well. The other part that made the Judean religion different was their food laws, the prohibition against pork, the prohibition against mixing dairy with meat. Those are just 2 things in particular. A prohibition against blood in relation to food, so the food had to be cooked all the way through. All those things were food laws that were unique to Judean religion. And this really did make Jews different than the people that they were around, and would have been even more pronounced in the diaspora rather than in Judea. While there was a large population of non-Judeans in Judea in the first century because of the Greek and Roman influence. It was still a Judean region. It was Judea. So these things would have been more taken for granted among Judeans. But when you lived in the diaspora in Babylonia, Egypt, Rome, Greece, Asia Minor, these characteristics would have certainly separated them from regular society, and it would have been much more noticeable in those areas. Before we get into why is Matthew considered the most Jewish gospel, I just want to give you this slide and show you that by the end of the first century of the Common Era, by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, Jews had spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. And these lines show the migration of Judeans across the Greco-Roman world, from Rome as far west as France, all over North Africa, really. Carthage, Cyrene, Alexandria was a large population of Judeans there. One of the most famous one was Philo of Alexandria. He was a philosopher and historian. These show migrations to Babylon during the exilic period. There had been a historic Jewish population there for nearly 500 years by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written. And here you have the other migration. This is Asia Minor right here. This is Greece and Macedonia is up north. Italy and Rome, all there. So you can see where Jews were in the diaspora during the time the Gospel of Matthew was written. So what does it mean that Matthew is a Jewish gospel? Matthew refers in a sustained and serious way to Jewish scriptures. And we want, and the reference point here is not the Hebrew Bible, which is important. The reference point in the Gospel of Matthew is the Septuagint, or LXX. LXX is Roman numerals for 70. Septuagint means 70. And it was because tradition has it that 70 Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And when the Gospel of Matthew quotes Scripture, the Gospel of Matthew quotes the Septuagint, the Greek translation. The Gospel of Matthew does not quote the Hebrew Bible, which is one of the strong reasons why scholars believe the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Greek. There was a long time belief that the Gospel of Matthew was written originally in Aramaic or even in Hebrew, but because of the way the Gospel of Matthew works with the Septuagint in particular, it caused scholars to believe that that wasn't the case, that the Gospel of Matthew didn't quote from the Hebrew Bible, but from the Septuagint. Matthew 1:1 begins, the Messiah, Christ, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham. These are all titles of the Jesus of Nazareth in the very first verse of the Gospel of Matthew. Messiah means anointed one. This is a very Judean concept. All of the kings of Israel were anointed in front of Israel in a public coronation ceremony. So Messiah literally means one who is anointed as the leader of Israel. So this had deep political connotations, that Messiah was one who was in the lineage of David, or the kingdom of David. Son of David absolutely means that. If you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, there's a narrative where God and David are speaking, and God tells David that David's sons will be God's sons, and his kingdom would have no end. So the Son of God, the Son of David, are synonymous terms. Son of God is not a divine concept. It is a very human concept, deeply related to the concept of Messiah. And son of David, son of Abraham, only deepens the genealogy of Jesus into the history of Israel. This is important throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew attempts to show time and time again, through quoting the Septuagint, that Jesus is deeply ingrained in Judeanness. And so Jesus' Jewishness or Judeanness is emphasized throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And here you have this quote in Matthew 1:22, and this is the first time this formula happens in the Gospel of Matthew. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And here you'll see all the places where Matthew comes back to this formula. Chapter 2, 5b through 6, again in verse 15b, again in 17 through 18, 23b, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 8, chapter 12, chapter 13. As you can see, Matthew uses this formula 14 times. So the idea that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, of the Septuagint, is very important for the Gospel of Matthew. So Jesus is, again, rooted. Not only is he the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham, he's rooted in Scriptures themselves. And I'm not saying that he was. I'm saying that Matthew's making that argument to show Jesus' Jewishness. And then in Matthew 5:17, this concept of Scripture even is heightened. Here, this is Jesus' first public sermon, and Matthew has Jesus saying, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So this idea that Jesus fulfills the Scripture in this formula, and in 5:15, where he says it himself, is deeply rooted in a Judean, Jewish understanding of Scriptures. So this is just one reason why scholars think that Matthew is a Jewish gospel, a deeply Jewish gospel, because so much of Matthew involves the Hebrew Scriptures. And then in Matthew, he refers to specific Jewish customs and belief. Chapter 8, verse 4, "But go, show yourself to a priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." There is no exclamation in Matthew 8:4 that describes what this is. And so it is not just it's not just a reference to a specific Judean custom, but it takes for granted that the reader would understand what this is and why it was important, because Matthew gives no rationale for it. It's just a statement, and it's understood that the reader would know why. So this kind of taken for grantedness of Jewish customs and belief run throughout the Gospel of Matthew. There in the very next chapter, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Here, again, this custom of fasting, this belief in fasting, is taken for granted that a reader would even know what this means, because it doesn't quote any scripture, it doesn't give any rationale of belief of why fasting was important. But there's an argument about Pharisees fasting and the disciples of Jesus not fasting. And this was a big issue. So it's totally indebted to Jewish custom here, and totally understood that a reader would know exactly what was going on. And then finally, here Matthew refers to the general Jewish cultural and religious thought world of the first century, specifically related to Gentiles. And this is incredibly important for Matthew. If you read Matthew 2:1 and following, and then specifically chapter 15, 21 through 28, where the Gospel of Matthew says that Jesus is speaking with a Canaanite woman, Later on, when we get to this section of Matthew, we will spend a lot of time with it because Canaanites hadn't existed uh, for centuries by the time Jesus was on the scene. So that idea of Canaanite is a loaded term. In the other Gospels, it's not used as Canaanite. It's called the woman's called a Syro-Phoenician woman, which is very first century. But the idea of Gentiles as outside of the covenant with God, those who did not believe in the one God of Israel, is basically everybody but Jews. And Judeans typically derided Gentiles as insufficient, ignorant, sexual deviants, and all these kind of things. Matthew is in the same thought world. So the Canaanite woman in chapter 15 is Jesus calls her a dog, and there's no problems with that. It's everybody takes it for granted that she is some kind of unclean thing because she's not Judean. And so that conception of Gentiles runs deep in the Gospel of Matthew. And that's important because Matthew, the whole Gospel of Matthew, is not only telling the story of Jesus, it's trying to outline the way Gentiles are incorporated into the Jesus movement, which is a contentious issue in first century Judaism and the emerging Christianity. So that is the Jewish context of the Gospel of Matthew. Read Saldarini and Warren Carter this week. Saldarini's whole point is that the entire Gospel is written from a Jewish Christian community. And Saldarini's work really kind of outlines what that community looked like. So Saldarini is the reason we're reading Saldarini this mod is because the way he highlights the Judean context of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, on the other end, you have a Roman context, and this is the reason why we're reading Warren Carter's work. So please pay attention to these readings. Not only is your midterm and final coming directly from these readings will help you fully understand the Roman context and the Judean Jewish context of the Gospel of Matthew. But now let's focus now on the Roman context of the Gospel of Matthew. In the year 63 before the Common Era, General Pompey of Rome lands on the coast of Caesarea. Well, it wasn't even Caesarea at the time. On the coast of this city on the water in Judea, and he annexes Judea. And so the political powers that were running Judea at the time acquiesced. They did not fight. They did not challenge Rome. They accepted Rome's annexation. And they did so probably because they're on a border. They're a border nation between Rome and Persia, and they were giving their allegiance to Rome because they thought that Rome was more powerful and they would be able to protect them from the Persians for if there was ever any kind of war between the two. Herod was Rome's client king. Client is an interesting word because there's a patron-client conception in the first century, specifically related to Rome, where Rome is the great patron, and everybody else is subservient and a client to Rome. So if you were a legitimate client, Rome would take care of you and provide you with what you needed, but you had to pay taxes back to Rome, and as a way of saying thank you and accepting that. So Herod was a client king. They accepted Herod's kingship and his political leadership over Judea. Sometimes Rome would come in and do away with the political structures that existed in these independent regions and then institute their own government. Now, that would eventually happen in Judea, but when Pompey came in to annex this, Herod was already a good friend of Augustus Caesar, so they let him stay in charge, and he ruled for a very long time. You'll see here 74 to 73, all the way to 4 BC. That is an extended dictatorship, really, because Herod was a terrible ruler. But when he died in the year 4 BCE, his kingdom, Judea, or the Judean province, was divided among his sons. And so Archelaus received the region of Judea, and he ruled for about 10 years there, 4 BCE to 6 of the Common Era. Herod Antipas took the Galilee and Perea, which was up around the Sea of Galilee, so it's a little bit farther north. And he was able to have a reign there for a long time. You'll see 4 to 39 of the Common Era. Now that's a very long time for this time period because it was such in political turmoil. But this is the Herod that we hear of most in the Gospels. So there are 3 Herods: Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, and Herod Agrippa. And you'll see that Agrippa came in after Herod Antipas. So there is some confusion in the Gospels and the New Testament about which Herod is which, but there's at least 3, and this is how they break down. Philip, this other son of Herod, took the east of the Jordan, which was a small region, and wasn't a real successful leader there. Not long after that, and these were all, while Herod was a client king, all these were tetrarchs, and they absolutely did whatever Rome told them to do. There was just no, they did not exercise independence from Rome. They actually got their authority from Rome and ruled from that authority. Herod Agrippa did more so than the others because in 39 he was given control over the whole of Judea again. But you can see that only lasted for about 5 years. He was a very good friend of, I think it was Claudius, the Emperor Claudius. But when Claudius was deposed as the Emperor of Rome, so was Herod Agrippa. So after when Claudius was deposed, there was some uproar in Rome, and so there was a fight within Rome about who would run the empire. And it's during that time, from 44 to 66, that Rome did away with all these leaders. So they did away with the political structure of Judea that was headquartered in Jerusalem, and they took direct control from 44 to 66 through their governors. So they would, the Roman emperor would appoint governors to Judea, and those governors would run the country. And so 44 to 66 was a time where Judeans didn't even have their own leaders, which became a major point of conflict. Even while they had their own leaders, Herod and his sons and Herod Agrippa, they were Judeans, but they were certainly did whatever Rome said. But at the end of the day, they were still Judeans who were in charge. And so they might have flexed their strength, and all their strength came from Rome, but at least they were still Judeans. From 44 to 66, these were Roman leaders who were appointed by the Roman government to govern Judea, and this was very contentious. The Judeans felt that this was not only wrong politically, but this was wrong from a religious standpoint, and it caused a tremendous amount of controversy. So much so that in 66, here we'll just kind of jump down. In 66, there was a revolt against Rome, and it created the Jewish-Roman War that lasted for 4 years. From 66 to 69, the Roman legions were brought in from Antioch, where the Gospel of Matthew was most likely written. And Vespasian was the general of the army at the time, and he came down and just destroyed all of Judea. And during that time, he was called back to Rome, and he became the emperor of Rome, and he left his son Titus in charge to finish the Jewish revolt. So in 70 of the Common Era, Titus and his army, the Roman army, utterly destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple there. During that the time of the governors, the Pontius Pilate from 26 to 36 was an important figure. Felix from 52 to 60, Festus. These two are important because Paul mentions them. No, Paul doesn't, but the Gospel of Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke, who also wrote the Acts of the Apostle, mentions both Felix and Festus. Albinus and Florus are two other important leaders at that time. It was under Albinus when James, the leader of the Jesus movement in Jerusalem, was killed. And then Florus was important because he led it up to the revolt. He was the governor when that happened. So that kind of gives you the idea of the Roman context. It was under this kind of political, social, even religious oppression that not only was the Gospel of Matthew written, but the whole life and ministry and death of Jesus was under this kind of Roman context too. So the Roman context in Palestine was heavy, just like it was all over the Roman world, but it was so tumultuous that it led to a revolt and war that ended with the temple being destroyed in Jerusalem. And it's out of that experience, the Gospel of Matthew is only written about a decade to 2 decades after this traumatic experience, that it was a definitive moment in Judeanness and Judean movements across the world at that time. The Jesus movement, the movement that later became Christianity, is absolutely influenced by this revolt. So not only is Matthew deeply Jewish, and it has a deeply Jewish context, it also has a deeply Roman context, and specifically related to how it understands Gentiles. I mean, when your country is destroyed by another country, how do you relate to those people? And the Gospel of Matthew is trying to negotiate that relationship. How do Judeans who believe in Jesus interact with Gentiles who may also believe in Jesus or who want to believe in Jesus? This is a primary component to the Gospel of Matthew. Here you'll see the Roman province of Judea. Judea makes up this area right here. Samaria is also in there, and Idumea. But this whole area is the province of, well, almost all of this here is the province of Judea. And within the province of Judea, you see these little sections divided up. This would have been, Perea would have been the area where Philip, one of the sons of Herod, ruled. This is the Galilee. This line here goes around to the Decapolis. These are all major regions. The Syro-Phoenician woman that's mentioned in Matthew 15, he calls her a Canaanite. This is where she would have been from. There's these mentions of Jesus going into the area of Sidon and Tyre throughout the Gospel of Matthew. This is a very Gentile area, Gentile heavy. And just north of here is Antioch of Syria. Damascus is the capital of this part of Syria. Antioch would have been the capital of the other part. So you can see geographically where this was. So let's talk about the provenance of Antioch, or the Antioch as the place of origin for the Gospel of Matthew. One reason we believe that that's the case is because of Ignatius. He was a bishop of Antioch by the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century. And he quotes Matthew within a decade of the gospel being written. So if Matthew was written in 80 to 90, Ignatius quotes Matthew, small portions of Matthew within 10 years. And here you'll see some of this, some of his quotes. So this quote right here is from Ephesians 14:12. This is letters. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, wrote a letter to the city of Ephesus, the church there, to the Ephesians, and he quotes Matthew 12:33. The tree is known by its fruit. Here in his letter to the Smyrnans, chapter 6, verse 1, he quotes Matthew 19:12. Let him accept it who can. And then in this letter to Polycarp, he quotes Matthew 10:16. In all circumstances, be wise as a serpent and perpetually harmless as a dove. These are places where the Bishop of Antioch quotes the Gospel of Matthew, and Ignatius is very early. So we think that Ignatius probably knew the writer of the Gospel of Matthew because the time period is so close. The other one is Paul's description of the Antiochene church in Galatians chapter 2, 11 through 14. This is incredibly important because it's in this short letter of Paul where he narrates conflict between him and Peter. Peter was one of the major leaders of the early Jesus movement. Peter was generally in Jerusalem, but apparently Peter had made the journey up to Antioch to see where Paul and Barnabas' ministry really first started and to determine whether they were doing the right thing or not, specifically related to how they were letting Gentiles into the church and whether by doing so they were violating any scriptures. And so Peter comes there, according to Paul, in his letter to the Galatians. Peter seems to be endorsing Paul's ministry until men from James are sent from Jerusalem. And James is the primary leader of the Jesus movement at that time. When these men arrive in Antioch, Peter withdraws fellowship from the Gentiles. In other words, Peter does an about-face. Now, this is all according to Paul. So Peter says that Paul's doing wrong when the men show up. Paul calls Peter a hypocrite, but the men from James are so influential that Peter remains on their side, and Barnabas, Paul's co-worker, forsakes Paul and follows those guys. And so Paul writes his letter to the Galatians and basically says that Peter and Barnabas and the men from James were all wrong. And specifically, Paul said that Gentiles did not have to be circumcised, nor did they have to follow food laws to be followers of Jesus. Now, this was incredibly contentious because according to the Jewish scriptures, according to the law, that's exactly what Gentiles had to do to become Judeans and believe in the single God of Israel. And so Paul says because of Jesus, they don't have to do that anymore. And this is not just a big issue for Paul. This is one of the defining arguments of early Christianity. And the Gospel of Matthew is mediating that issue. So this is another reasons we think that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Antioch. And finally, issues in Matthew relate most to what's happening in Antioch. The way Matthew deals with Gentiles in chapter 15 and in chapter 2:1, that indicates that the Gospel of Matthew is in the middle of this argument in Antioch. And the way Matthew understands the law. The law is not undone by the ministry of Jesus or by belief in Jesus, according to the Gospel of Matthew. For Matthew, Jesus doesn't abolish the law. Jesus doesn't make the law invalid. Jesus actually fulfills the law, which is exactly what chapter 5, 15 through 21 says. So Matthew is mediating this issue related to Gentiles entering into the covenant with the God of Israel in what seems to be a pretty conservative way, and in a way that puts him at odds with Paul. So that's the context, that's the Roman context, that's the Jewish context, and that's the context within Antioch of Syria that produced the Gospel of Matthew. Now for the next few minutes, we're going to pay attention to actual passages from the Gospel of Matthew. And we'll look first at Matthew chapter 1 and 2, these birth narratives. This is a terrible painting. I mean, it's a great painting, but it's a terrible depiction of what's called the slaughter of the innocents. Um, let's see here. Herod's plan. Matthew chapter 2, 13 through 28 tells that Herod the Great, after learning that Jesus was born from the Magi from the east, he has this plot to kill all the male children under 2 in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. And this is a picture of the slaughter of the innocents. You can see them decapitating the little children. This is a part of the birth narrative in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, what I want you to do is look at the genealogy of Matthew 1 through 17. This is where Matthew talks about Jesus' genealogy, and compare that to the genealogy in Luke chapter 3, 23 through 38. I want you to spend some time after this presentation reading carefully the differences between these genealogies. Neither one of these genealogies are in the Gospel of Mark, and it's totally absent in the Gospel of John. So Matthew and Luke are doing very different things with Jesus' genealogy. They go back to different places and they go in different directions. So read them carefully and pay close attention to how different they are. Matthew, right after the genealogy, Matthew narrates the birth of Jesus in chapter 1, 18 through 25. This birth narrative in Matthew is incredibly different than the birth narrative in Luke. So read Matthew 1, 18 through 25 and Luke 1, 26 through 38, and then Luke 2, 1 through 7. And just as you read, I want you to take notes on Matthew, just the series of events that happen and who are the main characters. So write both the main events and the main characters of Matthew 1, 18 through 25 in one column. And then in the next column, read this passage from Luke and see who are the main characters and how the theme is totally different. So you'll see that there's massive difference between Matthew and Luke. This is the differences here, the fact that they both have a genealogy and they both narrate the birth of Jesus, but they do it in such radical difference. These are two very different birth narratives. This indicates that Matthew and Luke did not know each other, and they didn't have Matthew did not have a copy of Luke beside him when he was writing his gospel, and Luke did not have a gospel of Matthew beside him when he was writing his gospel. They wrote their gospels totally independent of each other, and you'll see that where they're in these areas where they're totally different. In Matthew 2, 1 through 12, this is a pretty fascinating passage because it narrates the wise men from the east. This section is only in Matthew, along with Herod's plan to kill all the young children. These are only in Matthew. So the wise men from the east that you hear during Christmas time, that is only in the Gospel of Matthew. That is not in any other place in the Bible. They're not in the Gospel of Luke, or Mark, or John. So Matthew's narration of the men in the east, the wise men in the east, or the magi from the east, or the kings in the east, they see a star and they follow that star to Jerusalem. This is only in Matthew. And when they get there, they go to the king of Israel, Herod the Great, and ask where the new king of Israel is, because according to them, the stars say that a new king is born. And this is where Herod gets very paranoid, and he tells them, go find the child and then let me know where he is so that I too can worship him. So the Magi from the east go around. They find Jesus in Bethlehem. They bring him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then an angel warns them in a dream that they should not respond to Herod and let them go. So it's a pretty fascinating material, but it's only in Matthew. It's not in any of the other Gospels. So after warning the Magi go east, don't tell Herod, and this is when Herod plots to kill all the young children in Jerusalem because he feels like there's going to be a threat to his throne. Then we get this passage in Matthew immediately following that. It's only in Matthew that there's a flight to Egypt. So Mary and Joseph, realizing that Jesus is under threat, go to Egypt and stay there a couple of years. And when they return, they come back to Bethlehem, but still are afraid. And that's when they move to Nazareth. This is a really different version of events than what Luke has. Luke has them in Nazareth. They go to Bethlehem for Jesus to be born because there's a census. And there's no mention of Herod the Great. There's no mention of the slaughter of the innocents. They go back to Nazareth, and it's not a big deal. Matthew is a very different story. The flight to Egypt is reminiscent of Moses. Moses as a child being born in Egypt and coming out of Egypt. This is a motif that follows Jesus throughout the narrative of Matthew. Almost at every turn, Matthew has Jesus as the new Moses, or the next Moses, or the new lawgiver. And so this is an incredible motif and a very important motif in Matthew, that Jesus goes into Egypt and comes back out of Egypt. I'll back up here a little bit to the wise men. This section is important for the Gospel of Matthew because these are Gentiles who recognize that something has happened. And this is at the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew begins to deal with Gentiles. Chapter 2, 1 through 12 is the first sustained narrative that involves Gentiles. And these Gentiles recognize that Jesus is the new king of Israel. And they come and pay homage to Jesus. Now, this is very important because from the very beginning, from the very outset, Matthew says that there are Gentiles who understand who Jesus is, right? So this is actually a good story of Gentiles, that God speaks to Gentiles. God or angels reveal God to Gentiles, and Gentiles are able to recognize who Jesus is. It does not mean that they are exempt from the law, and that'll be a constant theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew. So in both of these places, I want you to spend a long time reading Matthew and Luke over against each other and just see how radically different they are from each other. Read the wise men, see how they're portrayed in the narrative as good characters. And Herod is actually the bad character. Herod is a Jew that doesn't believe or knows that there's a significance about Jesus, but tries to destroy it. This is a big part of the Jewish context of Matthew. And then it's interesting to read this passage from Luke just to read it over against this narrative of Jesus' flight into Egypt and back. So that's the birth narrative, Matthew chapter 1 and 2. Let's look now at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which we find in Matthew chapter 3 and 4. Here, this mosaic is from a church in Ravenna, Italy. It's a beautiful church. And this is their baptistry. So often to the side of the church is this place where they baptize, and above the baptismal font is this mosaic of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. This is Latin for Jordan. Here you have the dove descending on Jesus. It's a fascinating mosaic, and I just wanted to share it. But this is where, chapter 3 is where the Gospel of Matthew begins to use the Gospel of Mark as a source. And so you'll see Matthew 3, 1 through 12, almost mirroring Mark 1, chapter 1, 2 through 8. In the Gospel of John, it's real interesting. John the Baptist is in all four Gospels. There are very, very few stories in the four Gospels that exist in all four Gospels, and John the Baptist is one of them. So it's worth noting. But also, uh, the John the Baptist story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is very different than the John the Baptist story in John. So while it's in all four, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very different than the Gospel of John. So look at Matthew 3, 1 through 12, and how John the Baptist is depicted. Here's where you'll see almost verbatim quotes from the Gospel of Mark. Also look at Luke chapter 3, 1 through 9. There in Luke, you'll also see how Luke deals with the material in Mark. I do want you to spend some time with these biblical texts and read them over against each other. See how Matthew, these are small differences, but watch how Matthew changes the wording of Mark. Look at how Matthew uses Mark as a source and then expands this story. What does he neglect? What does he add? And then do the same thing with Luke and see how Luke is using his source. And then you'll be able to see how Luke and Matthew are using Mark differently as they go through this passage. So there's the John the Baptist story, who John the Baptist is and what he was preaching in the desert. And then following that in the Gospel of Matthew, you have Jesus' baptism, when Jesus was baptized himself. You'll notice something really strange about John if you want to read John, but pay close attention to how Matthew differs from Mark. You see here, it's just a couple of verses. They don't quote verbatim, but it's very close. So just like you did with John the Baptist, Matthew, how Matthew used Mark as a source and Luke used Mark as a source, pay close attention to Jesus' baptism. In Mark, you have Jesus, listen to God's voice. There's a voice from heaven that speaks. Who does that voice from heaven speak to? Does that voice from heaven speak to Jesus, or does that voice from heaven speak to everybody around? Ask that question about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As soon as Jesus is baptized, there's a progression. There's a progression in all these Gospels because they're following Mark, of course. There's an explanation of John the Baptist, Jesus' baptism, and as soon as Jesus is baptized, in all Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as soon as he's baptized, he's taken into the wilderness to be tempted. Again, this is great material to read back and forth. You'll see that Mark only gives very little information about this, so only 2 verses, compared to Matthew's 17 verses and Luke's 13 verses. So watch how Matthew and Luke use the Mark story of the temptation of Jesus and expand on it. These are great areas to really see how Matthew's using Mark and how Luke uses Mark differently than Matthew. And then right after Jesus' temptation, the overcoming of temptation, you have Jesus calling his first disciples and the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Again, read them over against Mark and Luke. Specifically these passages. It happens really quick in these narratives. Jesus calls the disciples and they follow him. But spend some time looking at the difference between Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the calling of the first disciples and ministry. Specifically, who are these disciples? Does Jesus call them by name? Pay close attention to all of that as you spend some time reading through this material this week. That's our whole lecture for the Gospel of Matthew this week. Hopefully you've understood that Matthew has deep connections in a Jewish context. Matthew is produced from a Jewish context. Matthew's produced out from under a Roman context. That context particularly happens to be in the city of Antioch in Syria. And then you look at these passages in Matthew 1 through 4, 1 and 2 being the genealogy and birth narratives of Jesus, and then you look in chapters 3 and 4 for Jesus' baptism and the beginning of his ministry. Pay close attention in your reading of the text, and look at how Matthew uses Mark and how different that is from Luke. If you have any questions, simply send me an email, and I'll respond to you as soon as I can. All the best.